On the 24th of March 603, Queen Elizabeth I of England and Ireland died at Richmond Palace near London. The last child of King Henry VIII was 69 years old and had died without an heir, having never married, and after cultivating the idea of herself as the Virgin Queen. Her passing led to a swift flurry of activity as messengers headed north to Scotland, where they informed King James VI, ruler of that nation, that his cousin had died and that the English throne was now vacant. Elizabeth had never confirmed that James should succeed her and had left the question of the succession hanging in the air for decades. It was by no means a certainty that the Scottish monarch would ascend to the throne of England without opposition. Nevertheless, as James proceeded south with his courtiers and followers to London in the late spring and early summer of 6003, it became clear that the Scottish monarch would assume the role of King James I of England. The House of Stuart that he ushered into power would reign for over a century, lasting until the House of Hanover in 1714. Initially, it might appear peculiar that the Scottish royal family ultimately came to rule England in 6003, but in reality, foreign-tainted dynasties were the norm in England. Since the unification of England by the House of Wessex back in the 10th century, the throne had passed through numerous dynasties. Several individuals came from France and only gradually became English over time. The Tudors, of which Elizabeth was the last monarch, were as much a Welsh dynasty as an English one. When the Scottish House of Stuart, established by James I in 1603, passed from the scene in 1714, they were replaced by the German House of Hanover. This is the story of the peculiar dynastic history of England, from the first unification of the realm under the House of Wessex down to the formation of the British state when the House of Stuart gave way to the House of Hanover. England only emerged gradually as a concept and then as a unified kingdom. The word England itself effectively signifies the land of the Angles. The Angles were one of the primary Germanic groups that sailed to Britain in the 5th century AD and subsequently occupied large portions of the island after the Romans strategically withdrew from the island in 410 AD. Other Germanic groups that joined the Angles included the Saxons, who largely originated from the coastal regions of northwestern Germany and what is now Denmark. In the centuries that followed, numerous Anglo-Saxon kingdoms emerged in the former lands of Roman Britain. The reign of Rome had encompassed England and Wales, albeit Scotland or Caledonia, as the Romans had termed it, had never been subservient to Roman authority. Thus, the notion of England was conceived as the land that was once governed by Rome. Over time, Wales came to be regarded as a distinct entity, as the pre-Roman Celtic Britain element persevered strongly here, even after the arrival of the Angles and Saxons. A ruler of the most powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdom, King Offa of Mercia, constructed a large dike or series of defensive earthworks along the border between England and Wales in the 8th century AD. Hello, I'm delighted to assist you with our voice service time. These same war parties began to actually seize territory and establish their own kingdoms in the lands they were attacking. In the realm of England, the great heathen army, as chronicled by Christian accounts of the era, arrived in the year 865 and commenced conquering large portions of the eastern and northern regions of the county, surrounding Northumbria and East Anglia. Mercia, whose primary power base was situated in northwestern England and the Midlands, was subsequently weakened and became a vassal of the Danes for a period of time. However, by the time the Danes proceeded southward in an attempt to conquer Wessex in the 878th decade, their momentum had begun to wane. In 878, the young King of Wessex, Alfred, emerged victorious against the Danes at the Battle of Edington. Over the subsequent 20 years, until his demise in 899, he undertook the task of unifying a significant portion of England under his rule, bringing East Anglia and Mercia broadly under the control of Wessex. This marked the inception of the establishment of the Kingdom of England, and Alfred is frequently regarded as the first king of England. Although this is not expressly true, Northumbria remained under Danish rule for numerous decades to come, and Mercia was only loosely controlled by the House of Wessex at this time. Alfred is known as Alfred the Great, not because he managed to fully unify England under his rule, but because he halted the Danish advance, commenced forcing the Danes in East Anglia and other places to convert to Christianity, and also because he paved the way for the full unification of the kingdom by his son and grandson. In the 10th century, he was succeeded by his son, Edward the Elder. In a rather confusing development, historians of later centuries, looking back at the history of medieval England, would choose to call these early monarchs by a descriptive name like the Great or the Elder, rather than by a regal number like Alfred I or Edward I. Edward the Elder was arguably the first king of England. His father Alfred had proclaimed himself to be Anglorum Saxonum Rex, meaning King of the Anglo-Saxons, asserting the belief that he ruled over all of the Anglo-Saxons rather than all of England. Edward the Elder continued with this title, but he succeeded in reducing Mercia and Northumbria to his rule for a time, meaning that he was briefly in charge of virtually all of modern-day England. However, it was really his son Athalan, succeeding Edward in 924, who was the first undisputed king of England. Athalan finally reduced Mercia and Northumbria comprehensively to his rule and unified the kingdom. In the year 927, he initiated the utilization of the title Rex Anglorum, signifying the King of the English. Furthermore, he subsequently proclaimed himself on official charters and coins to be the Rex Totius Britanniae, King of the entirety of Britain. Although this declaration was a grand assertion for a ruler who did not yet possess any significant control over parts of Wales or Scotland, Athalan was the first unequivocal king of England. The dynasty that his grandfather, father, and he had established is referred to as the House of Wessex. During this era, the majority of people in Europe did not possess surnames, and thus the first royal family of England was identified by the kingdom which they ruled. The House of Wessex theoretically governed England for nearly 1.5 centuries after Athalan first began declaring himself Rex Anglorum in 927. However, this was a complex period of English history. While the country remained unified throughout the remainder of the 10th century and into the 11th, the Danes remained a problem. New armies arrived from Denmark and Norway periodically, but now the royals of those two countries were intermarrying with the House of Wessex. The royal line of Wessex kings ruled fairly uninterrupted down to 1013. In that year, a Danish warlord named Sweyn Forkbeard invaded and overthrew Ethelred the Unready. Following a tumultuous series of wars in the years that ensued, during which time both Sweyn and Ethelred met their demise, Sweyn's son Knut succeeded as King of England in the year 1016. He married Ethelred's widow, Emma of Normandy, in an endeavour to establish some semblance of legitimate ties to the House of Wessex, although, in reality, a brief separate dynasty was established by Sweyn and Knut, known as the House of Denmark. For a period under this Danish royal family, England emerged as an imperial power. King Canute also ascended to the throne of Denmark in the year 1018, and subsequently assumed the crown of Norway in the year 1028. This signifies that, for a period of time, he reigned over an expansive North Sea empire. Canute the Great, as he is commonly referred to, ruled until the year 1035. Upon his demise, two of his sons, Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut, continued to uphold the House of Denmark until the year 1042. However, when Athelstan died suddenly and without an heir, Edward the Confessor, a son of Ethelred the Unready, who had been overthrown 30 years prior, established the House of Wessex as the rulers of England. Edward the Confessor acquired his name due to his profound religious devotion. The 11th century was a period of Christian revival that would ultimately culminate in the launch of the Crusades to the Holy Land and against the pagans of Northern Europe at the end of the century. In the case of Edward, Christianity possibly influenced his decision to adopt a vow of celibacy, despite being married to Edith of Wessex, the daughter of one of the most powerful heirs of the realm. For any monarch, celibacy is problematic, especially in medieval times when their foremost duty was to have children and preserve the royal line. Although it is not known with absolute certainty that Edward refused to consummate his marriage, what is known is that he and Edith never had children. Consequently, when he died on the 5th of January in the year 1066, the direct line of the House of Wessex died out with him. Following Edward's demise, his brother-in-law, Harold, Edith's sibling, asserted his claim to the throne. Theoretically, this marked the inception of a new royal dynasty, the House of Godwin, named after Harold's father, the powerful Godwin. Ultimately, this would become the shortest-lived dynasty in English royal history. Meanwhile, a separate claim to the throne had emerged from across the English Channel. William, Duke of Normandy, ruler of Normandy in northern France, was a second cousin of the recently deceased Edward the Confessor, as Edward's mother, Emma, had originated from Normandy. Thus, as is very well known, William led an army of his Norman knights across the English Channel and defeated Harold at the Battle of Hastings on the 14th of October, 1066. This decisive engagement, which resulted in the death of King Harold and numerous members of the ruling elite of Anglo-Saxon England, brought the House of Godwin to an end after just over 9 months and ushered in the rule of the House of Normandy. The Norman conquest would actually take several years to fully complete, with its violent methods involving the brutal subjugation of the Anglo-Saxons and Danes by the Normans, including scorched earth and mass land appropriations that were brutal but effective in consolidating Norman rule. The significance of the Norman conquest and the establishment of the House of Normandy as rulers of England cannot be exaggerated. This did not merely bring a new ruling dynasty to power. It altered the very culture and society of England in a profound manner. Prior to this time, the Anglo-Saxons had communicated in Anglo-Saxon or Old English, a language that was almost strictly Germanic in nature. Presently, it became intertwined with the Old Norman French spoken by William and his Norman knights, thereby giving rise to a unique blend of languages. This language originated as a Romance language derived from the Latin of the Romans. Over a period of time, the two languages gradually merged in England to form the modern English language, a hybrid language that combines elements of the pre-Norman Germanic tongue and the post-Norman Romance language. The legal and court system underwent a transformation as well, with the bizarrely, French would remain the official language of the law courts in England until the early 1730s as a result. These were just some of the changes wrought by the Norman conquest. More immediately, William the Conqueror, or William I, established his closest followers as barons all over England, setting up a Norman aristocracy. He ruled down to 1087, though he spent much of his time in northern France and continued to view himself first and foremost as ruler of Normandy. Two of his sons, William II, or William Rufus, and Henry I, ruled successively after him. Henry would rule until 1335, perhaps after organizing the murder of his brother to become king himself all the way back in the year 1100. Much of his reign was characterized by a succession crisis after his only legitimate male heir, William Adeline, was killed in a sea accident known as the White Ship Tragedy of November 1120. Henry spent much of the remainder of his reign trying to convince his nobles that his sole surviving legitimate child, Matilda, should succeed him. However, In an age when leading men into battle was one of the main duties of a monarch, the idea of a female rule ultimately proved impossible to sell to his lords. Civil war ensued upon his demise in 1135. The Anarchy, as it is known, was an intense period of civil war that commenced in 1135 and lasted down to 1154. Matilda attempted to press her right to the throne and had a large contingent of supporters, but others threw their support behind Stephen of Blois, a grandson of William the Conqueror on his mother's side. Stephen was the de facto king for much of the period of the anarchy, though both sides succeeded in capturing their respective rivals during the years of civil war, only to have them escape or be rescued again. While both also stressed that they were the legitimate monarch, England was torn apart in the process. Medieval chronicles of the 12th century clearly indicate that the period of anarchy was particularly devastating for the county. Vast areas of England were left impoverished during the conflict. Ultimately, the war between Stephen and Matilda came to a concrete conclusion in 1154, as Stephen's designated heir, Eustace, had predeceased him in 1153. Consequently, when Stephen himself died the following year, it paved the way for Matilda's son Henry to become King Henry II. Notably, the names of dynastic houses change when succession occurs via the female line. This signifies that upon ascending to the throne, Henry's claim was rooted in his maternal lineage, tracing back to William the Conqueror. Nevertheless, as the offspring of Geoffrey Plantagenet, he subsequently became the inaugural monarch of the House of Plantagenet. His father, Geoffrey, held the title of ruler of the county of Anjou in northwestern France, thereby implying that the House of Plantagenet was, in theory, a French dynastic house as well. Henry II would reign over England for 35 years. His tenure was often marred by controversy, particularly due to his endeavours to exert greater crown control over the English Church, a move that ultimately led to a confrontation with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket. Becket was eventually murdered in 1170 by supporters of Henry amidst the dispute. The atrocious nature of this act was particularly egregious, as it occurred on consecrated ground within Canterbury Cathedral itself. Furthermore, Henry elevated the English crown to a position of unprecedented power. Perhaps this was the brief period when England had ruled over the North Sea Empire a century and a half earlier. Henry not only ruled England, but he also held Normandy and several other French lands inherited through the royal House of Normandy. His own father's inheritance had bestowed upon him the county of Anjou in France, while Henry's marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine placed him in control of a large part of western France. These territories centered on Aquitaine and Gascony and the important port city of Bordeaux. Furthermore, the English crown was already exercising extensive control over Wales, although this control was not yet complete. Henry II further asserted his authority and attempted to make vassals of both the King of Scotland and the Dukes of Brittany in northwestern France. Finally, in 1169, Henry sanctioned the invasion of Ireland by some of his leading nobles, commencing a history of English intervention in Ireland, which still resonates to this day. Such was the power of the English crown by the latter stages of Henry II's reign that historians generally write about an empire during these days. The name Anja originates from the county of Anjou, which encompassed England and Wales, portions of Ireland, and nearly half of modern-day France, particularly in the north and west. The Ona Empire of the House of Plantagenet proved nearly as short-lived as the North Sea Empire of Knut the Great. The problem arose when Henry died in 1189. His son and heir, Richard the Lionheart, or King Richard I, was about to set off to lead the Third Crusade to the Holy Land. This was arguably the most famous of all the Crusades, for the manner in which Richard and the Muslim warrior Saladin sparred with one another for control of Jerusalem. However, Richard's focus on the reconquest of that city meant that he consequently spent the first half of his reign far from home. In the absence of King Richard, his less capable younger brother, John, attempted to revolt against the nobles whom Richard had appointed to govern in his stead. The crown was significantly weakened, largely due to the fact that Richard had diverted a substantial amount of resources towards the crusade, and many of those who had been subjugated by the English crown in France, Scotland, and Wales during the reign of Henry II began to exert a renewed independence. Richard ultimately returned to his domains in Western Europe in 1194, after essentially bolstering the Crusade cause in the Holy Land, but failing to retake Jerusalem. He spent the subsequent 6 years endeavoring to reconstitute full control over the Angevin Empire. However, in 1199, he succumbed to his demise at the tender age of 41 years, due to a wound he had sustained in battle that had become gangrenous. His marriage to Berengaria of Navarre, a princess of the Basque region in northern Spain, had been without offspring, as the pair had spent minimal time together following their union while he was on crusade. Consequently, John now ascended to the throne as King John I. There is perhaps a reason why there has never been a King John II. The first one proved to be a disaster as a monarch. He had conflicts with the Church and was excommunicated by the Pope. Most disastrously, he engaged in warfare with the French crown, resulting in the loss of the vast majority of his family's extensive dominions in France, including the Duchy of Normandy, the lands from which William the Conqueror had staged his conquest of England. It was not merely that John managed to lose most of the House of Plantagenet's vast territories in France in a disastrous war that commenced in 1902 and continued onward. Additionally, he quarreled intensely with his own nobles in England, his homeland. The earls and barons of England were unhappy, as it stood, with the catastrophic loss of lands in France. What was worse, John had increased the burden of taxation so that he could raise new armies to attempt to stem the flood of losses to the French. Other points of conflict between the crown and nobility included the king encroaching on baronial privileges of land held by the Church. All of this resulted in growing tensions which erupted in the 1210s. In 1212, some barons conspired unsuccessfully in a plot to kill John. The situation grew worse in 1214, when John effectively lost his battle against the French, and his losses on the continent were confirmed. As pressure on the king grew, he agreed to issue a royal charter known as Magna Carta, Latin for Great Charter, in 1215. Magna Carta is a foundational document of English constitutional history and in the development of modern democracy. Certain rights held by the nobles of the realm, which had to be recognized and respected by the king, were stated within it. The Great Charter also limited the power of the crown and is viewed by many as the first step in a very long process, whereby a constitutional monarchy was developed in England. Magna Carta would go on to influence everything from the United States Constitution to the French Revolution. That being said, the charter failed to prevent a more intense war breaking out between John and the nobles within a short period of time, specifically a matter of years. It was also almost immediately broken by John, resulting in the outbreak of more conflict. This was the First Barons' War, lasting from 1215 to 1217, and was punctuated by John's death in 1216 from dissent. John's premature death at 49 years of age meant that his son Henry, who had just turned 9 years old, succeeded him as King Henry III. This was a less than ideal situation for a kingdom in crisis, and yet Henry's reign proved comparatively more successful. It was a protracted period, in fact, the longest in English political history up to that point, with Henry reigning down to 1272, 56 years after he first ascended the throne. Following his ascension to ruling in his own right in the 1220s, he successfully stabilized the situation. Furthermore, he made an attempt to resume the war effort in France, to to reclaim some of the lands his father had lost. Although he was ultimately unsuccessful in this endeavor, Henry eventually came to arrangements with the French, in which the English king apparently began to accept the reality of the situation. Henry was, in essence, a very capable monarch, someone who ruled for a lengthy period and improved the situation he inherited from his father, albeit without much pomp. The greatest compliment that could be bestowed upon him is that he helped stabilize England. The country was on a stable enough footing by the conclusion of his reign that his son, King Edward I, became one of England's most successful monarchs. Edward was the monarch who came closest to compensating for England's loss of its extensive territories in France by nearly conquering all of Britain. He can lay claim to being the monarch who finally reduced Wales effectively to English rule, while in the 1300s he also managed to assert English control over Scotland for a brief period of time. Meanwhile, English control over large parts of Ireland was expanding and would reach its highest point at the start of the 14th century, before entering into decline as a result of what historians refer to as the Gaelic resurgence there. Unfortunately for King Edward I and the Plantagenet dynasty, strong kings are often followed by weak ones, and this was becoming a very common pattern for the custodians of the English throne. When the Conqueror of Wales died in 1307, he was succeeded by his son Edward II. The new monarch became infamous for promoting royal favourites like Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser, some of whom may have been his male lovers. In turn, these individuals and their families exploited their influence over the king to build up large factional networks. They accumulated substantial power and wealth, thereby disrupting the social equilibrium in the process. To further complicate matters, the conquest of Scotland was widely perceived as figures such as Robert de Bruce led a revolt against English rule. This opposition in Scotland had already taken root in the time of Edward I, but now worked to achieve Scottish independence once again. Matters were not alleviated by a terrible famine which ravaged Europe in the mid-310s, the significance of which is often overlooked because of the even more deadly arrival of the bubonic plague to Europe these decades later. Eventually, Edward's favoritism towards the Despense family alienated a large number of his nobles, including the powerful Roger Mortimer. He thereafter entered into a relationship with Edward's own wife, Isabella of France, and they overthrew Edward II in favor of his young son, King Edward III, who became king in 1327. A 14-year-old King Edward III might have become King of England in January 1327, but it was effectively Mortimer and Isabella who ruled England. That is until 1330, when Edward demonstrated his acumen at a young age by moving against Mortimer and having him killed. He then began to rule in his own stead. Edward's reign, the second longest prior to the 18th century, would last down to 1377 and would have enormous implications. In 1337, he went to war with France. He also oversaw the creation of the most centralized kingdom in late medieval Europe, one that was capable of responding to problems because of an effective government, taxation system, and judiciary. Moreover, Edward led the country through a cataclysmic crisis in the shape of the Black Death, the first and most violent wave of the bubonic plague. The Black Death ravaged Europe from 1346 onwards, killing an estimated 1/3 of the population of the continent over the next decade. It was also Edward who was largely responsible for building Windsor Castle into the great centre of royal power that it became west of London. It was the onset of the 100 Years' War, wherein the monarchs of England endeavoured to re-establish their continental empire in France, and, if possible, even unify the crowns of England and France under one rule. Initially, Edward encountered considerable success in the 1340s and 1350s, but over time his endeavours stagnated. By the 1360s and 1370s, the war was evolving into a stalemate, albeit with the English having claimed parts of northern France around Normandy and a solid power base in the west centered on Bordeaux, Aquitaine, and Gascony. King Edward III was arguably England's greatest medieval monarch, for he not only revitalized the crown's position in France, but also rectified the humiliations suffered during the reign of King John. His marriage to Philippe of Anjou, a noblewoman from a powerful aristocratic house in the Low Countries, would prove enormously consequential for the dynastic politics of England for well over 100 years. Edward and Philippe had 13 children in all. Several of these died either in infancy or because of the Black Death, but 5 of the boys lived to become adults. The eldest, Edward, the Black Prince, was a formidable figure who became England's war leader in France in the 1460s, but he died 1 year before his father and never became king himself. Of the others, the third, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, was in many ways the most important. John inherited vast estates around England, and his branch of the royal family became extremely influential. Others, such as the descendants of the second eldest son, Lionel, Duke of Clarence, and the fourth eldest, Edmund, Duke of York, would soon play a role in a fresh wave of unrest and civil war in England from the late 14th century onwards. The death of King Edward III in 1377 ushered in the familiar pattern of one capable and strong English ruler being immediately followed by a weak and reckless one. In this instance, Edward was succeeded by his 10-year-old grandson, Richard II, the son and heir of the Black Prince. Richard began to rule in his own right as he grew up in the 1380s. Problems began to appear quickly, of a kind that echoed the reign of Edward II at the start of the century. Richard was inclined towards favoring upstarts amongst the nobility, often based purely on his personal relationships with them, rather than honoring the seniority and power of the more established noble lines. By the late 1380s, there were already moves to force him into acting in line with what the senior nobles of the realm wanted. The alliance of English nobles who opposed him, which included John of Gaunt's young son and heir, Henry Bolingbroke, managed to curb his worst impulses for a time. However, in the 1490s, the king became more assertive again and pushed back against those who had tried to resist him in the 1380s. His relationship with his first cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, became particularly tense and eventually ended with Bolingbroke going into exile in France. Richard then refused to acknowledge Bolingbroke as successor to his father's vast titles and lands after John of Gaunt died early in 1399. Henry struck quickly. That summer, while Richard was campaigning to revive royal authority in Ireland, he crossed to England and seized control of the country in an almost bloodless clash. Richard was captured and deposed upon returning to England, whereupon Henry was crowned as King Henry IV of England. This event, in certain respects, constituted a continuation of the House of Plantagenet. However, Henry is frequently regarded as the first monarch of the House of Lancaster, following his father's ducal title. The most striking aspect of King Henry IV's reign was his seizure of power and establishment of the House of Lancaster. Thereafter, he encountered his own difficulties rather swiftly, discovering that it was considerably easier to oppose the king than to actually rule. Firstly, he faced the largest rebellion in Wales of the late medieval era, led by a local ruler by the name of Owen Glendower. In addition to these challenges, he suffered from premature ill health and faced opposition from an emerging faction at court that surrounded his own son and heir, Henry of Monmouth. His health affliction, possibly leprosy, and certainly including a severe skin affliction, ultimately claimed his life in 1413, just shy of his 46th birthday. As a result, his young son succeeded as King Henry V at just 26 years of age, although he was already a seasoned political figure and military commander by that time. King Henry V's reign would be relatively brief, but one that was hailed by his contemporaries and by subsequent generations of English historians. He ended the revolt in Wales and then resumed the 100 Years' War against the French after a period of some prolonged reluctance to seek military engagement in France since Edward III's day. On the 25th of October, St. Cisan's Day, 1415, Henry and his English longbowmen dealt a crushing defeat to the heavy cavalry of the French at the Battle of Azincourt. During the period that ensued, the English were to assert control over France, reaching its high water mark as Henry forced the French into the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. Henry then married Catherine of Valois, the daughter of King Charles VI of France, with the understanding that Henry would succeed the aging and mentally unstable Charles as King of France upon his demise. The dream of Edward III to unite England and France under one of his descendants seemed to be nearing realization. In the midst of the 15th century, a pattern persisted in English monarchical history, wherein events unfolded in a circular manner. At that time, a most unfortunate occurrence took place, as Henry V, a remarkably adept monarch, met his demise at the tender age of 35 years in the year 1422. It is highly probable that his untimely passing was attributed to dysentery, a debilitating intestinal affliction characterized by severe diarrhea. This same malady may have also been the cause of death for the Black Prince nearly half a century prior. In both instances, the premature demise of the Black Prince and Henry VIII ushered in an era of minority rule, as a juvenile now ascended to the throne. With regard to the succession of Henry V, this was the monarch's 9-month-old infant son, Henry VI. Similar to Richard II before him, he would mature to prove an ineffective ruler. His reign was dominated by his cousins and a string of overmighty aristocrats, including the Beauforts, a coterie of nobles descended from John of Gaunt and his third wife, Catherine Swynford. The war effort in France experienced a sharp decline for the English during Henry VI's reign, culminating in the effective termination of the 100 Years' War in 1453. Upon receipt of the news of the final English defeat on the continent, Henry, the king, suffered a serious psychological collapse, becoming catatonic for a period of nearly 1.5 years, between the summer of 1453 and the end of 1454. As his reign descended into disaster, support for Richard, the third Duke of York, a great-grandson of King Edward III, grew sharply. Soon, war would follow. The series of conflicts which began in 1455 is known as the Wars of the Roses, owing to the fact that the ruling House of Lancaster had a red rose as part of their heraldic symbol, while the House of York, with Duke Richard at its head, had a white rose as part of its coat of arms. The outbreak of the conflict in 1455 was surprisingly caused by the partial recovery of Henry V. Henry's recovery ensued that the Beauforts and others around them could assert their authority over the weak king. In response, York's supporters urged him to wage war. The first stage of the conflict was brief and saw Richard and the Yorkists win a major victory at the First Battle of St Albans on the 22nd of May, 1455. Thereafter, Richard was established as Lord Protector of the realm, the de facto head of Henry's government. Nonetheless, the Beauforts and Henry's queen, Margaret of Anjou, did not accept the situation, and in 1459 the war was resumed. Richard increasingly realized he would have to claim the throne for himself. However, he died at the Battle of Wakefield on the 30th of December 1460 before he could realize his ambition. It was his son and heir, Edward, who ultimately accomplished this feat. In the initial months of 1461, he achieved a series of striking victories, and that summer he was crowned as King Edward IV of England, thereby establishing the House of York as the new ruling line. An endeavour to overthrow Edward and restore Henry to the throne would be renewed in 1470, but it ultimately failed in 1471. During that year, Henry and his son and heir, Edward of Westminster, were both killed, thus bringing an end to the immediate Lancastrian threat to the New Yorkist monarchy. The House of York might have continued to rule England for decades or even centuries to come, had it not been for Edward's premature death in 1483, resulting from some unknown illness, possibly typhoid or pneumonia. He left behind two young, healthy sons, one of whom immediately succeeded him as King Edward V. However, the actions of Edward IV's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, served to undermine the new dynasty. Following his brother's death in 1483, he was appointed as regent for his 12-year-old nephew. He promptly took steps to secure the throne for himself. Edward V and his brother were placed in captivity in the Tower of London, never to be seen again. As Richard soon proclaimed himself as King Richard III, this heinous act towards his own nephews provided an opportunity for a Welsh upstart by the name of Henry Tudor, who was at this time in exile in Brittany and France. King Henry's claim to the throne originated through his mother, Margaret Beaufort. Nevertheless, this claim was exceedingly weak, as the Beaufort children were born out of wedlock and were only legitimized toward the conclusion of John of Gaunt's life, based on the stipulation that they could never succeed to the throne of England. Furthermore, on his father's side, Henry was predominantly of Welsh heritage. In spite of these obstacles, in 1485, he crossed into Wales with a small army, marched into England, and defeated Richard in combat at the Battle of Bosworth Field, during which Richard III was killed. Subsequently, Henry claimed the throne as King Henry VII, the inaugural monarch of the House of Tudor. He would encounter several attempts to remove him from power, but he successfully defended himself and effectively brought an end to the War of the Roses by marrying Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter, thereby theoretically uniting what remained of the houses of York and Lancaster. Upon Henry VIII's death in 1509, his eldest surviving son ascended to the throne as the new monarch. King Henry VIII is regarded by some as the most controversial of all England's rulers. Often overlooked, however, is the fact that he was highly popular during the first half of his 38-year reign. His marriage to Queen Catherine of Aragon was characterized by mutual respect. Initially, Henry was not yet the tyrant that he would later become. His ascension to the throne was met with jubilation following the dark years of Henry VII. Henry VIII had been a very shrewd and successful monarch, but he was not a king who earned the adulation of his people. His primary desire had been to suppress any resistance to the new dynasty and to place England's finances back on a firm foundation. Meanwhile, Henry VIII, by way of contrast, was youthful, athletic, and determined to renew the war with the French. Over time, circumstances underwent a transformation. By the 1920s, his marriage to Catherine of Aragon had yielded merely a healthy daughter. Henry had no legitimate male heir with which to secure the royal succession. Subsequently, he became embroiled with Anne Boleyn. Shortly thereafter, he became consumed by an obsession with divorcing Catherine and marrying Anne. He was assured that Anne would deliver him the son he needed. Ultimately, Henry had to sever ties with the Roman Catholic Church and had his government infiltrated by a Protestant faction in order to acquire his divorce, though he himself was no Protestant. When Anne failed to rapidly produce the male heir, Henry's worst impulses truly took hold. He would go through 4 more wives by the early 1940s. These women included Jane Seymour. An heir of Cleves was not among them, but rather Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr. Ultimately, merely one of the 6, Jane Seymour, delivered to him the son he desired, a boy named Edward. Throughout this period, Henry had transformed into a distinctly tyrannical figure. His initiation of the Protestant Reformation was subsequently followed by the dissolution of the religious orders in England, a decision which brought enormous amounts of wealth into his coffers. He promptly squandered this wealth, however, through a fresh, pointless war against the French in the 1540s that achieved virtually nothing. Upon Henry's death in January 1547, it must have been a relief to numerous individuals. It was certainly a boon to the Seymour family, who now rose to power within the government through the new monarch. The fruit of Henry's brief marriage to Jane Seymour was King Edward VI, who inherited the throne at an age too young to rule by himself at first. The Protestant faction was soon back in favour at court, having lost power at the start of the 1940s as Henry reacted against the very same religious changes he had initiated. A more thoroughgoing Protestant Reformation was effected by 1950, one which leaned towards Calvinism, the more austere branch of Protestantism that had been developed in Geneva by Jean Calvin in the 1930s. For instance, the Latin Mass was replaced with a service in the English language, as dictated through the First Book of Common Prayer, issued in 1549. As Edward grew into his teenage years, it was clear that he also expressed fervent Protestant beliefs. Clearly, the half-hearted drift towards the Protestant camp that had occurred under Henry VIII was going to become cemented under Edward. That is, until Edward became severely ill in 1553 and died that summer, perhaps from tuberculosis. His passing meant that Henry VIII's daughter from his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon now became the first ever full Queen of England, as Matilda had only ever been a claimant to the throne back in the days of the anarchy 4 centuries earlier. May, oft referred to as Bloody May, was resolute in her endeavour to steer England back towards the Catholic faith, and, as part of her programme of religious transformation, she had hundreds of Protestants burned at the stake. By that time, the majority of English people still adhered to Catholicism, and Protestantism in England would have been suppressed had it not been for May's own demise, which apparently resulted from uterine cancer in the year 1558. Consequently, it was that the last surviving legitimate child of Henry VIII, the daughter whose birth had been such a disappointment to him when she was born to Anne Boleyn back in the year 1533, ascended to the throne as Queen Elizabeth I. The reign of Elizabeth was marked by paradox. She ruled for 45 years and, in the 19th century, was lauded by Victorian historians as the monarch of England who paved the way for the British Empire. Certain aspects of this are true. Explorers like Martin Frobisher, Humphrey Gilbert, and Francis Drake explored the Atlantic and even circumnavigated the world during her reign and under her patronage. Walter Raleigh had attempted to establish the first English colony in what would become the United States. Ireland was firmly conquered after centuries of struggling and battling with the dozens of independent Gaelic lords there. At home, the Protestant Reformation was cemented in place in a more moderate form known as Elizabeth's Middle Way, under the guidance of Pope Pius V and the influence of various European monarchs, including those of Spain and France. During the reign of Pope Gregory XIII, and after the death of Pope Gregory VII, in the year 1850 was not a relevant date. However, the events did occur in the 16th century. As Anglicanism emerged, England successfully undertook an extensive war against Spain, the world's first truly global superpower during the era. It was English troops that assisted the Dutch Republic in asserting its independence from Spanish dominion, and England resisted several attempted invasions by the Spanish. The most notable of these, of course, was the attempted invasion by the Spanish Armada in 1588. What was remarkable about this period was that Elizabeth was not a particularly strong monarch. She delayed and procrastinated over every decision that needed to be made, often dividing the members of the Privy Council, the Cabinet of Ministers, who actually ran the realm from day to day amidst her indecision. Moreover, there existed a complex psychology within the woman whose mother had been executed on the orders of her own father when she was merely an infant. Elizabeth would never marry, though the necessity to produce an heir meant that she entertained numerous royal suitors from France and even Sweden during the 1660s and 1770s. Ultimately, when the Virgin Queen died in 1603, her Scottish cousin James, a descendant of the Tudor line through the marriage of Margaret Tudor, one of Henry VIII's daughters, to King James IV, exactly 1 century earlier, rode south to claim the throne. The House of Tudor had come to an end after 118 years, and the House of Stuart rose to power in England, finally uniting all of Britain under the rule of one man, not by conquest, as monarchs like Edward I had attempted, but by the simple happenstances of marriage and biology. James I's reign was in many ways amongst the most successful in English or British history. During his reign, the initial foundations of England's overseas colonial empire were established. The first permanent English colony in North America was founded at Jamestown in Virginia in 1607. 13 years later, the Mayflower arrived at New England. By the end of his reign in 1625, the first English colonies in the Caribbean were being established on some of the smaller islands there. The reign of James also had far-reaching implications for Ireland, as the Ulster plantation saw an influx of thousands of Scottish settlers to the north of the county, a development which still has implications today. Under the guidance of Pope and other figures of that time, including those from the city of Rome. However, James was also a profligate monarch who was reckless in how he lavished financial gifts on his court favourites. This contributed to some extent to the difficulties of his son, King Charles I's reign. Yet, it was not simply that Charles inherited poor finances. As part of his quest for more money, Charles also sought to become an absolutist monarch who would rule without parliament and impose religious uniformity across Britain. In the process, Charles's actions would attempt to reverse hundreds of years of constitutional evolution in England since the time of the Magna Carta back in 1215. The political community, primarily Parliament, was reluctant to accept this, and in 1642, civil war erupted in England. The English civil wars that characterized the 1640s were part of a wide series of conflicts across the Stuart dominions that had commenced in Scotland in the late 1630s, and which included a major rebellion in Ireland from the late autumn of 1641. These are more broadly known today as the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. In order to overcome them, Charles constantly sought to play one side against another. He even countenanced allying with the Catholics of Ireland to help him defeat his enemies in Parliament in England in the mid-1640s. Ultimately, due to his intelligence and persistent deceitfulness, even after he suffered a military defeat, Charles was vanquished by the parliamentarians. The radical faction of the parliamentarian movement, led by Oliver Cromwell, put Charles on trial and executed him on the 30th of January, 1649. Furthermore, Cromwell's faction was unwilling to accept another claimant to the throne in his place. Consequently, for a brief period of 11 years, between 1649 and 1660, England became a republic, with Cromwell serving as Lord Protector between 1653 and 1658. This marks the sole occasion in England's extensive history when the country was a republic. 2 years after Cromwell's death in 1658, this radical experiment was abandoned. Charles I's son and heir returned home from the continent, and the monarchy was restored, albeit with the king's power now curtailed after the chastening defeat of Charles I in the 1640s. The time in which England was still an individual kingdom, distinct from Scotland and Ireland, albeit one ruled by the same monarch, was drawing near to an end, and soon a more unified British state emerged. This last period prior to the Act of Union and the end of the reign of the House of Stuart was a time littered with contradictions. On the one hand, after Charles II was restored as king in 1660, a period of hedonism ensued that contrasted with the dour Puritanism of the 1650s. Charles II's reign was a period of heavy drinking and cultural vitality in London. Nevertheless, underlying tensions persisted, primarily regarding religious affiliations. Charles was, at most, a moderate Protestant. Worse still, his brother James, Duke of York, who succeeded him as King James II in 1685, adhered to Catholicism. This circumstance was deemed unacceptable to a significant portion of the political realm, and in 1688 they extended an invitation to his daughter Marie's husband, William of Orange, the most powerful noble of the Dutch Republic, to arrive in England and assume power. William duly did so. The glorious evolution that followed saw James flee to France as his supporters abandoned him. William and Mary now became the new co-monarchs, William III and Mary II. Most importantly, in 1689, the Bill of Rights was issued as the basis whereby William and Mary would assume the throne. It effectively stated that no decision could be imposed on Parliament unilaterally by the Crown. When the Magna Carta had commenced to establish the inalienable rights of certain parts of the English political community nearly 500 years earlier, the Bill of Rights was the defining moment in the transition to a constitutional monarchy in England. As a result, in the 18th century, Parliament would supersede the monarch as the effective government of England and Britain. This process, whereby the constitutional monarchy matured into a modern democracy in the 18th and 19th centuries, would ultimately take place under a new dynasty and within a new state apparatus. Two events occurred in the early 18th century that led to this. Firstly, in 1707, the Act of Union was passed to unite the thrones of England and Scotland. During the reign of James I, the two counties were brought under a single rule when he travelled south to London in the year 6003. However, the two countries remained separate entities and continued to be administered as a Scottish entity in Edinburgh. The Act of Union marked a significant turning point, paving the way for the establishment of the British state. Furthermore, an additional Act of Union in 1801 would ultimately give rise to a unified kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Additionally, the House of Stuart came to a close, a mere 7 years after the enactment of the Act of Union of 1707. Mary II had passed away in 1694, and her husband had followed in 1702. The consequence of this was that May's sister Anne became the last monarch of the House of Stuart in 1702. She was a woman with a tragic natural history, having lost all of her children from 17 pregnancies. Consequently, when she died in 1714, the direct line of the House of Stuart came to an end. Her successor was George, the Elector of Hanover in northern Germany, a great-grandson of King James I on his mother's side. It was the House of Hanover that would oversee Britain's emergence as a global imperial power in the 18th century. The monarchical era of England was drawing to a close. A new Britain, characterized by its constitutional monarchy of Parliament and Crown, was now emerging. The dynastic history of England, spanning from the first emergence of a unified Kingdom of England in the 10th century to the active union in 1707, is a complex tale. This narrative involves upwards of 9 dynasties, if one considers the House of Lancaster and York as distinct from the House of Plantagenet. Additionally, it includes the very short-lived House of Godwin in 1066. Of these dynasties, the majority originated from outside England, at least on the paternal male side. The royal lineage of Denmark, dating back to the 11th century, was a Danish royal line, whereas the houses of Normandy and Plantagenet had origins in France. The Tudors originated from Wales on the paternal side, and the Stuarts came from Scotland. These families were now being succeeded by a German family, although all of them had connections to England, particularly on the maternal side of each family. Regardless of their origins, each of these dynasties had overseen periods of significant change in England, which had undergone its transition from a medieval monarchy to a constitutional monarchy in the 18th century. Moreover, England had survived through these transformations, with the houses of Denmark, Normandy, and Plantagenet, as well as the Tudors and Stuarts, all playing a role in shaping the nation's history from the 11th century onwards through 18 centuries of change. Notwithstanding endeavours by the Danes, the Spanish, and others to integrate England into a continental kingdom over the centuries, England had remained autonomous. Furthermore, it had come to exert dominance over both Britain and Ireland. During the 18th century, its power continued to expand. Buoyed by an ambitious mercantile and colonial class in London, colonies had been established in North America, the Caribbean, and India by the conclusion of the 17th century. The empire would evolve into the world's foremost superpower and subsequently alter the history of the world. What are your thoughts regarding the dynasties of England throughout the medieval and early modern periods? Was a particular house or dynasty accountable for England's emergence as a great power in modern times? Or did the British Empire ultimately emerge due to the manner in which the constitutional monarchy struck a balance of political power in England, thus creating a powerful business and colonial class? We appreciate your feedback and thank you very much for watching.